lighting in Blender is fairly fairly uncomplicated, at least at first. And so we're going to just discuss the different types of lights and how they function and how to use them. So by default, I just created a simple scene with a couple objects, and I'm in the render view, and I'm rendering in cycles. So I've got it pretty high quality render going, and literally by default, the light that comes loaded into any scene in Blender is set up in this spot where it is now, and you can select the light, and once you select the light, you have different set of options in the properties window. So you've got this little green icon for a light, and you can click on that to see the different options you have here. So the first thing we're going to do is let's just start from scratch. Let's delete this light that comes loaded. Okay, so the scene kind of goes dark, more or less, and there's really no lights in the scene here. So Shift A in order to create a new object or add an object, and just like any of your other objects, you can create lights and cameras. So if you click on light and go to the first choice, you're going to select a point light, and by default it creates it in the center of the scene at the origin point, or at the 3D cursor at the origin point, and you can hit G to grab it, and now you can kind of lift it up so you can see what it's doing. So in real time, you'll be able to see as it moves how it's affecting the shadows of your scene. Okay, so I'm going to zoom out a bit, and I'm going to just grab this light and drag it along the y-axis forward, a little bit in front, and then grab it again and drag it along the x-axis. Alright, so the point light source works like, let's see if we rotate it. Yeah, it doesn't really do anything. So if you use the point light source, it creates a direction. The light's coming from wherever direction you have the light, so at least if you're pointing it, but there's no real kind of cone around it. That's a different light called a spotlight. So in this case, we've got four general types of lights. The point light, very useful, very versatile kind of light, and to increase the power of the light, the default is set to 10 watts, which is really low. If you make it 100, you notice that it gets different. If you make it 1,000, it starts to get too bright. So you'll have to experiment with your scene. I'm going to start with 100, and then I'm going to play a little bit with where its placement is. So if I grab it and move it again along the x-axis. Now if I grab it and move it along the y-axis back behind the objects, you're going to backlight the object. So obviously you've got light coming from behind. The shadows are created here. So if I turn around, right, it's fairly intuitive process. And when you're lighting your scene, it might be helpful to go into your camera view so you know what the rendering is going to look like. And for me, I like to go into this quad view by hitting Control Alt and Q on a PC. I think it's Control Option Q on the Mac or something like that. One of those three. And you can then grab the light and you can manipulate it in a little bit more intuitive of a way. Maybe making some nice long shadows. So if you grab it and you bring it on the z-axis closer to the ground, you're going to be creating, some longer shadows. If you grab it up up on the z-axis, you're going to end up making shorter shadows. So it acts pretty much like a single light source. Okay, so that's using the point light source. If you just simply change it right in this window, change it to sun, it's going to change the properties drastically. So for the one thing, the sunlight is incredibly strong. Let me go back to something. Oh, let me talk about something before I move on to sun. So in the point light, the size, it determines the sharpness of the shadow. It's very simple. If you bring the size down to 0, you create a very hard edge shadow. If you bring the size up, you create a very soft shadow, and somewhere in between. So you can create lots of different kinds of effects this way with those two options. All right, so moving, and you can also change the color of any of these lights. If you click on the color, you can just tweak. You can make a blue light, a yellow light, whatever. All right, so I'm going to bring this back to white and move over to the sun. So with the sun's strength set to 100, it's way too bright. So if you change it to 1, you might have something a little more reasonable. And in the case of the sun, the sharpness of the shadow is created by the angle. So if you create an angle of 0, you have a very hard-edged sunlight shadow. If you drag the angle up, you create soft shadow. But there's also something quite different about the way the sunlight works. It is a directional light. If we look at it by zooming out, it shows up on the screen like this. So if I grab it and I move it up on the z-axis, oops, that is not what I wanted to do. Grab the light and I move it up on the z-axis. It doesn't really change. The distance from the objects doesn't really do much. You notice that if I move it, it's not changing the shadows. So it doesn't work the same way as a point light source where you just change the angle. However, you just change the placement. So the shadows are literally staying in the same spot no matter where I move it. However, if I grab this little yellow thing, I then can affect the angle of the shadow. So I can make very long shadows here, like late afternoon. So if I grab it, move it here. Now if I do move it along this axis, again, it's not changing the angle of the shadow. The only way I'm going to change the angle of the shadow is this way. Right? So if I rotate, so now I've got the sun shining, it's shining from behind the objects toward the front of the objects. Now it's shining from the front to the back. See, it takes a little bit of getting used to the way this works. How the sunlight works. So let's look at one other thing with this and see what it does. If I so if I drag it this direction, create these nice long shadows, let's see how that looks. That's fairly interesting. Yeah, and find some good spot. Okay, so maximum bounces is not something you need to really worry about. You can of course turn on and off the shadow casting. So if we switch to the next one, we got a spotlight. Spotlight is a kind of version, it's like a point light source, very similar, but it creates also a cone around like an actual spotlight. So I'm going to bring the power up to 100 again. Actually, let's try 500. Okay, so zoom out here, and let's look at how this thing works. So in this case, you've got a different looking dial. If you grab this little blue arrow, you increase the width of the cone or decrease the width of the cone, so it's kind of makes it a more focused or broader view. If you drag the yellow, you change the rotation of basically where it's pointing. It's pretty interactive. Um, you can also do some of those things here. So where it says size here under spot shape, that's the same thing as dragging that blue arrow. I can make it smaller, and I'm not exactly sure what blend does. I'm curious, what do they say? Softness of the spotlight edge. Okay, oh yeah, so right. So bringing blend all the way down to 0, you create a very hard edge to your spotlight. Bring it up, softens the edge. Now, then up here is very much like the point light source. If you change the size here, you change the softness of the shadows being cast. So we've got two things going on. We've got the edge of the spot and then the edge of the shadows being cast by the light. So you can change that here. So small number here and a small number here. Sorry, with the blend, you can create a very hard edged look. Let's see. Yeah. Good. All right. And I guess if you move the whole spot, of course it does change. Rotating the spot around this axis will also affect it. All right, so that's 3 of the 4. Again, all the rest of the stuff is the same color. Area spotlight, it's a little bit, it's closer to the way a sunlight would work. Again, we've got this power dial, but it also kind of, let's see if I can show you by getting far enough away. So, let's see. If I grab it and get close to the object, it's saying that it's projecting a square shape. Now you can change these here. You don't see a huge difference. It's honestly not a light that I use much, but these functions are similar. You've got the softness or the hardness of the edge and the general shape and the power. So those are the settings. I think that you get much more use out of the 3 before it than the area light, but you could certainly find a use for this. Yeah, you can soften the shadows like this and grab the yellow thing to change the angle. So you do see it's kind of a square edge to it, as opposed to if you, I guess if you made it, still looks kind of square. All right, so those are your basic lighting types.